December 9, 1964. Inside a recording studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, engineer Rudy Van Gelder dims the lights. It's an unusual request, but this is an unusual session. A 38-year-old saxophonist named John Coltrane sits in the shadows with his quartet. 7 years earlier, he was a junkie, fired from Miles Davis's band, nodding off on stage, his career circling the drain. Now he's about to record what he calls a humble offering to God. The album will be recorded in a single day. 33 minutes of music across 4 movements. No rehearsal. Minimal direction. Just 4 men who know each other so well they communicate almost telepathically. Within months, it will become one of the best-selling jazz albums of all time. Within a decade, it will inspire an actual church in San Francisco, where congregants worship through Coltrane's music. Within 50 years, the Library of Congress will deem it culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant to the American experience. But on this December evening, as the lights dim and the tape begins to roll, none of them know any of this. They just know something sacred is about to happen. This is the story of A Love Supreme, the album John Coltrane recorded as prayer, and the world received as revelation. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is John Coltrane's. To understand A Love Supreme, you have to understand what John Coltrane was running from. Born in 1926 in Hamlet, North Carolina, Coltrane grew up in a deeply religious household. Both his grandfathers were reverends. His father played violin and ukulele. Music and God were woven into the fabric of his childhood. But when Coltrane was 12, tragedy struck like lightning. In the span of a few months, he lost his father, his grandfather, and his uncle. His mother had to move north to find work, leaving young John in the care of family friends. By the time he joined the Navy at 17, then moved to Philadelphia after his service, Coltrane had found a new religion, bebop. He'd witnessed Charlie Parker play saxophone, and the experience changed him forever. He practiced obsessively, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, running scales until his neighbors complained, chasing a sound he heard in his head but couldn't yet produce. By the early 1950s, Coltrane was good enough to play with jazz royalty. He worked with Dizzy Gillespie, Earl Bostic, and eventually Miles Davis. But alongside his rising talent came a darker companion, heroin. The drug epidemic that swept through the jazz world in the 1950s claimed many victims. For Coltrane, heroin became both escape and prison. He drank heavily too, anything to quiet the relentless voices in his head demanding perfection. In 1955, Miles Davis hired Coltrane for his first great quintet. It should have been Coltrane's breakthrough. Instead, it became his breaking point. Pianist Red Garland remembered Coltrane showing up to gigs barely able to stand. Miles, himself a recovering addict, had no patience for it. In April 1957, after a particularly disastrous performance, Davis fired Coltrane for the second time. He would be so loaded he couldn't play, a fellow musician recalled. He'd fall asleep on the bandstand with the horn still in his mouth. Coltrane hit bottom. He was 30 years old, broke, strung out, and unemployed. His wife Naima, a Muslim convert who had introduced him to Eastern spirituality, watched helplessly as the man she loved destroyed himself. Then something happened. Something Coltrane would later call a spiritual awakening. In the summer of 1957, John Coltrane went cold turkey. He locked himself in his mother's house in Philadelphia and went through withdrawal. For days he sweated, shook, and suffered. But he also prayed. He read the Bible. He studied the Bhagavad Gita and the Quran. He meditated. Years later, in the liner notes to A Love Supreme, Coltrane would write, "During the year 1957, I experienced, by the grace of God, a spiritual awakening which was to lead me to a richer, fuller, more productive life." But he didn't romanticize it. He also wrote about how he'd slipped back into old patterns, entered a phase which is contradictory to the pledge and away from the esteemed path. The journey wasn't linear. Recovery never is. What mattered was that Coltrane emerged from that summer a changed man. Not perfect, not cured, but focused, driven by something larger than himself. Miles Davis noticed immediately. When Coltrane called asking for another chance, Davis was skeptical. But when they played together again in December 1957, Davis heard it, something new in Coltrane's sound, a depth, an urgency, a technical facility that seemed almost superhuman. Jazz critic Ira Gitler coined a term for what Coltrane was doing, sheets of sound. Coltrane was playing so many notes, cascading so rapidly through chord changes, that individual phrases blurred into walls of texture. It was like he was trying to say everything at once. I found that there were a certain number of chord progressions to play in a given time, Coltrane explained, and sometimes what I played didn't work out in eighth notes, 16th notes, or triplets. I had to put the notes in uneven groups like fives and sevens in order to get them all in. This wasn't just technical virtuosity. This was a man trying to express the inexpressible, the divine, the transcendent, the mystical experiences he'd had during his darkest hours. In 1957, Coltrane also began working with Thelonious Monk, another giant of jazz and a deeply spiritual man. Monk taught Coltrane about space, about silence, about letting the music breathe. Those lessons would prove crucial. By 1960, when Coltrane left Miles Davis to form his own group, he was ready. He recorded Giant Steps, an album of dizzying technical complexity. He recorded My Favorite Things, which became a surprise hit. A soprano saxophone cover of a Rodgers and Hammerstein tune that somehow captured the zeitgeist of the early 60s, and he assembled what would become known as his classic quartet. The lineup was John Coltrane on tenor and soprano saxophone, McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, Elvin Jones on drums. Together they achieved something close to musical telepathy. McCoy Tyner, just 21 when he joined Coltrane, brought muscular block chord voicings that anchored the group. His left hand created a foundation solid enough for Coltrane to build cathedrals of sound on top of. We knew each other's musical vocabulary, Tyner later explained. If you play with somebody for years, you don't have to second guess. You can just about go where you're supposed to. Jimmy Garrison provided the bass, melodic, powerful, always grooving. He and Coltrane had an almost psychic connection. Coltrane would shift direction mid-solo, and Garrison would be right there with him, as if he'd known it was coming. And then there was Elvin Jones. Many consider him the greatest jazz drummer who ever lived. His polyrhythmic approach, playing multiple time signatures simultaneously, creating cross-currents and undertows of rhythm, pushed Coltrane to new heights. John had a very wonderful way of being flexible with the music, flexing it, stretching it, Tyner remembered. We reflected that kind of thing. He gave us the freedom to do that. From 1961 to 1965, this quartet recorded some of the most important jazz albums ever made. Live at the Village Vanguard, Ballads, John Coltrane and Johnny Hartman, Crescent. But something else was brewing. Coltrane was changing. He and his first wife Naima separated in 1963. He'd met a pianist named Alice MacLeod, and their connection was immediate, both musical and spiritual. Alice was also deeply interested in Eastern philosophy, meditation, and the idea that music could be a direct channel to the divine. They began living together, had a son in 1964. They'd marry officially in 1965 after Coltrane's divorce was finalized. Coltrane's music was becoming freer, more exploratory, more overtly spiritual. He was reading everything he could find about world religions, Hindu scriptures, Sufi poetry, Buddhist texts, Christian mysticism. He believed, as he told an interviewer, that all paths lead to God. His interest in Indian music deepened. He studied the concept of raga, musical modes that corresponded to different times of day, different emotional states, different spiritual qualities. He began thinking about music not as entertainment, but as prayer, as meditation, as a technology for accessing higher consciousness. By late 1964, Coltrane had an idea. He wanted to create a suite, an extended multi-part composition that would express his gratitude to God, a musical testimony, a love letter to the divine. One morning, according to his wife Alice, Coltrane came downstairs like Moses coming down from the mountain. He had the entire suite drafted out on paper, movements, themes, structures. This was unprecedented. Coltrane usually composed at the piano or on his horn, working things out intuitively, but this had arrived fully formed. He called it a love supreme. December 9, 1964 was a Wednesday. Outside Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, Christmas decorations were going up. Inside, the lights were dimmed. Rudy Van Gelder was already a legend. His studio had been the birthplace of countless Blue Note classics. He was meticulous to the point of obsession. No food or drink allowed, no touching the microphones, everything in its exact place. But he also understood jazz. He knew how to capture the intimacy of a nightclub, the immediacy of live performance. That's why he dimmed the lights, to create atmosphere, to help the musicians get into the right headspace. I remember the lights being dimmed, McCoy Tyner recalled. I'd never seen Rudy do that. It sort of set an atmosphere. There was just something very, very special about that particular session. Coltrane gave almost no verbal directions. The quartet had been playing together for years, testing material in live performances. They trusted each other implicitly. The album would consist of 4 movements, each with a title that suggested spiritual progression, acknowledgement, recognizing the divine resolution, committing to the spiritual path, pursuance, the struggle, the journey, the active seeking psalm, the culmination, the prayer, the offering. The first movement begins with the crash of a gong, like a bell calling the faithful to worship. Then Coltrane's tenor sax flutters in, searching, tentative. Garrison enters on bass with a four-note motif, F, A flat, B flat, F, four notes that would become the album's DNA. Coltrane begins to solo, circling around that bass line, exploring it from every angle. He plays variations, extensions, inversions. Then, near the end of his solo, he does something remarkable. He transposes the four-note motif into all 12 keys, one after another, as if demonstrating that God exists in every register, every tonality, everywhere you look. And then Coltrane does something almost unprecedented in jazz. He chants. His voice, multi-tracked, sings the words, "A love supreme," over and over, 19 times, a mantra, a prayer, a declaration. It's jarring. It's beautiful. It's unlike anything else in jazz history. Resolution, the second movement, is more anthemic. Coltrane's melody is noble, powerful, surging forward with purpose. This is the sound of commitment, of choosing the spiritual path despite all obstacles. Pursuance, the third movement, is the most aggressive. It begins with Elvin Jones unleashing a 90-second drum solo that sounds like thunder, like warfare, like all the struggles Coltrane faced in his addiction and recovery. Then Garrison takes an extended bass solo, 3 full minutes of deep, felt exploration. When Coltrane finally enters, he's reaching, striving, pushing towards something just beyond his grasp. And then comes Psalm. The fourth movement of A Love Supreme is perhaps the most profound piece of music John Coltrane ever recorded. The tempo is free, floating, Tyner's piano shimmers, Jones plays timpani instead of his full drum kit, Garrison's bass drones underneath, and Coltrane plays what he calls a musical narration. Inside the album's gatefold, Coltrane included a poem also titled A Love Supreme. It begins, "I will do all I can to be worthy of thee, O Lord." What Lewis Porter, Coltrane's biographer, discovered years later was astonishing. Coltrane is literally playing the poem on his saxophone, one note for each syllable. The melody follows the cadence of speech. When the poem says beautiful, Coltrane's playing becomes serene. When it says he always will be, his horn shouts. At the end, when the poem concludes with elation, elegance, exaltation, all from God. Thank you, God. Amen. Coltrane plays those exact words, and on Amen he adds a flourish, the only embellishment in the entire movement. It's a stunning piece of compositional architecture. Some scholars have compared it to the tradition of African American preaching, where the line between speech and song blurs. Others hear echoes of Gregorian chant, of Quranic recitation, of Hindu mantra. But mostly it just sounds like prayer. Deeply personal, profoundly moving prayer. The session for the quartet version took just one day. The following day, December 10th, Coltrane brought in 2 additional musicians, saxophonist Archie Shepp and bassist Art Davis, to record alternate versions. But when it came time to release the album, Coltrane chose the quartet recordings. That intimacy, that focus, was what he wanted. Producer Bob Thiel mixed the album. Engineer Rudy Van Gelder's recording captured every nuance. The rattle of Coltrane's reed, the resonance of Tyner's piano, the snap of Garrison's strings, the shimmer of Jones's cymbals. A Love Supreme was released by Impulse Records in January 1965. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Jazz fans recognized instantly that something special had happened. This wasn't just another John Coltrane album. This was a statement. Musical, spiritual, cultural. Critics praised it lavishly. Rolling Stone would later call it one of the greatest albums ever made in any genre. The jazz magazine Downbeat gave it maximum stars. Even mainstream publications that usually ignored jazz paid attention. But the album's reach extended far beyond the jazz world. The hippie counterculture embraced it. Young people experimenting with LSD, meditation, and Eastern spirituality heard in Coltrane's music a kindred quest. The Byrds were influenced by it. So were the Grateful Dead. Carlos Santana called it one of the most important albums he'd ever heard. A Love Supreme reached out and influenced those people who were into peace, Miles Davis observed. Hippies and people like that. By 1970, the album had gone gold, a remarkable achievement for a jazz record. It would eventually sell over 1 million copies worldwide, becoming one of the best-selling jazz albums of all time. But perhaps the most extraordinary testament to the album's spiritual power came from San Francisco. In 1965, a young couple named Franzo and Marina King attended a John Coltrane performance at the Jazz Workshop. They were celebrating their first wedding anniversary. What happened that night changed their lives. We experienced what we call our sound baptism, they later recalled. When Coltrane pointed his saxophone in their direction, they felt the music physically enter them, transform them. It was, they believed, a religious experience. The Kings started a listening club focused on Coltrane's music. It evolved into a temple, then a church. In 1982, they officially joined the African Orthodox Church, and John Coltrane was canonized as a saint. Today, the St. John William Coltrane African Orthodox Church still holds services in San Francisco. Every Sunday, they perform A Love Supreme as liturgy, with congregants chanting A Love Supreme in call and response. The album is their central text. Coltrane's teachings about love, unity, transcendence are their gospel. It's like saying Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, Archbishop King explained. It's like saying melody, harmony, and rhythm. You have to acknowledge, then you resolve, then you pursue, and the manifestation of it is a love supreme. Meanwhile, musicians continued to absorb the album's influence. In 1973, Carlos Santana and John McLaughlin recorded Love, Devotion, Surrender, an entire album devoted to interpreting Coltrane's spiritual jazz, including a cover of A Love Supreme. Both men were followers of Guru Sri Chinmoy, and they saw their project as continuing Coltrane's mission of using music to elevate consciousness. Hip-hop pioneer Rakim studied Coltrane's rhythmic complexity and applied it to his flow. The Roots sampled A Love Supreme. Kendrick Lamar cited Coltrane as an influence on his own spiritual explorations in music. Jazz musicians, of course, never stopped engaging with the album. Pharoah Sanders, who would later join Coltrane's group, created his own brand of spiritual jazz directly inspired by A Love Supreme. Alice Coltrane continued the tradition after her husband's death, releasing a series of transcendent albums that merged jazz, Indian music, and devotional practice. The album appeared on every greatest albums list. In 2015, the Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry, recognizing its cultural, historical, and aesthetic significance. But the full story of A Love Supreme includes a bittersweet coda. John Coltrane rarely performed A Love Supreme after its release. Only 2 live recordings are known to exist. One from a festival in Antibes, France in July 1965. Another from Seattle in October 1965, recently discovered and released. Why so few performances? Perhaps because the album represented a specific moment in Coltrane's spiritual journey. A summit he'd reached but now needed to move beyond. By 1965, Coltrane was already pushing into more radical territory. In June of that year, he recorded Ascension, a 40-minute explosion of free jazz featuring 11 musicians improvising simultaneously. It was shocking, confrontational, almost violent in its intensity. The classic quartet began to fracture. McCoy Tyner, uncomfortable with the increasingly free direction, left in late 1965. Jimmy Garrison stayed, but Elvin Jones departed in 1966, replaced by Rashid Ali. Alice Coltrane joined on piano. Coltrane was seeking something beyond what even A Love Supreme had achieved. He wanted to transcend melody, harmony, rhythm, all the traditional building blocks of music. He wanted pure spiritual expression, unfiltered by convention. Albums like Meditations, Om, and Interstellar Space alienated some fans who loved the accessibility of A Love Supreme and My Favorite Things. But for Coltrane, there was no going back. "I'm into something," he told his wife Alice. "I don't know what it is yet, but I'm into something." He never got to find out. On July 17, 1967, John Coltrane died of liver cancer. He was 40 years old. The disease had likely been developing for years, perhaps seeded during his time as a heroin addict, when contaminated needles could have transmitted hepatitis. Even his 1957 spiritual awakening couldn't undo that physical damage. His death shocked the music world. Alice Coltrane was left to raise 4 children alone while managing her husband's vast musical legacy. She retreated into spiritual practice, founding an ashram in California, recording her own extraordinary music. The quartet members scattered. Tyner became a bandleader, recording classic albums like The Real McCoy. Jones continued to work and teach until his death in 2004. Garrison died in 1976. But the music remained, and A Love Supreme continued to grow in stature, influence, and meaning. In 2002, critic Ben Ratliff wrote that A Love Supreme was the most perfectly plotted single piece of jazz ever recorded. In 2020, music writer Robert Christgau called it meditative rather than freewheeling, with each quartet member instructed to embark on his own harmonically mapped excursion. He admitted he'd listened to it on repeat with no signs of tune fatigue. What makes A Love Supreme so enduring? Part of it is musical. The suite is brilliantly constructed, simple enough to be accessible, complex enough to reward repeated listening. The four-note bass motif is as memorable as any pop hook, but the way Coltrane develops it across all four movements demonstrates compositional sophistication. Part of it is emotional. The album captures something universal about struggle, redemption, gratitude, and transcendence. You don't need to be religious to feel the sincerity of Coltrane's offering. Part of it is historical. A Love Supreme arrived at a perfect moment, 1965, when America was convulsing with change, civil rights, Vietnam, a whole generation questioning authority and seeking new paths to meaning. Coltrane's spiritual quest resonated with that larger cultural upheaval. But mostly it's about authenticity. You can hear it in every note. This is a man bearing his soul, sharing his most intimate conversation with the divine, holding nothing back. John is one of those rare musical figures who transcends both his time and category, writer Ashley Kahn observed. Today, in addition to jazz fans, rockers and rappers, headbangers and hip-hoppers all swear their allegiance to him. The album has been studied in music schools and theology seminars. It's been the subject of academic papers, doctoral dissertations, entire books. Jazz Night in America produced a documentary about the St. John Coltrane Church. Photographers Chuck Stewart and others captured images of the recording session that now reside in the Smithsonian. In 2015, a deluxe edition was released featuring all the alternate takes, studio chatter, and overdub sessions from December 9th and 10th, 1964. For the first time, listeners could hear exactly what happened in that dimly lit studio, the complete picture of how a masterpiece came together. What's striking is how little has changed. The original recordings still sound fresh, vital, necessary. Coltrane's saxophone still preaches. The quartet still communicates with that uncanny telepathy. The spiritual urgency still radiates from every measure. 50+ years later, people still discover a Love Supreme and have profound reactions. Still use it for meditation, for inspiration, for comfort. Still find in Coltrane's journey echoes of their own. In that 1966 interview, when John Coltrane was asked what he wanted to be in 5 years, he said, "A saint." He got his wish, though not in the way anyone expected. Not through canonization by the Catholic Church, not through any official religious body's decree, but through the St. John Coltrane Church in San Francisco, yes. Through the countless musicians who treat his recordings as sacred texts, yes. Through the millions of listeners who have found God, or something like God, in his music, absolutely yes. A Love Supreme is Coltrane's eternal sermon, delivered not in words but in sound. It's proof that jazz can be devotional music, that spirituality doesn't require churches or creeds, that music itself can be prayer. On December 9, 1964, 4 men sat in a dimly lit studio in New Jersey and created 33 minutes of music. One of them is gone, the others have since passed, but what they captured that day endures. It endures in the church services in San Francisco, where congregants chant a Love Supreme like a mantra. It endures in the countless albums it inspired, from Pharoah Sanders to Kamasi Washington, from Alice Coltrane to Esperanza Spalding. It endures in the consciousness of anyone who's ever struggled, recovered, and wanted to say thank you to whatever force pulled them through. John Coltrane called A Love Supreme his humble offering to God. The world received it as a gift from God. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what happens when art achieves its highest purpose. The line between human and divine blurs, and we can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story, and some stories, like John Coltrane's, never end. They just keep playing forever. A Love Supreme.